The morning she signed the papers, the cottonwood trees were shedding. Little white tufts of it drifted through the open window of the county clerk's office and settled on the desk, and Delia Marsh kept thinking about how her mother used to call it summer snow. Her mother was in a hospital bed 40 miles north, breathing through a machine that cost $400 a day, and the man sitting across the desk from Delia was waiting for her signature with the patience of someone who already knew she had no other choice. His name was Colt Rayner. He owned 11,000 acres in the Bitterroot Valley and a cattle operation that had been in his family for 3 generations, and he was 34 years old, and he was not unkind, exactly. That was the thing Delia kept turning over in her mind as the pen hovered above the line. He was not unkind. He had not threatened her. He had come to her with an arrangement, laid it out plainly on her kitchen table 2 weeks ago, and told her to think about it. She had thought about it every waking hour since. Her father's debt was real. $212,000, borrowed against the land he'd lost anyway, and now owed to Colt Rayner's estate because Delia's father had borrowed it from Colt's father 15 years ago and never paid a cent back. When the elder Rayner died, the debt passed. When Delia's father died 6 months later, it passed again. To her, Colt's proposal was this: marry him, manage the Rayner household for 1 year, and at the end of that year the debt would be forgiven in full, her mother's medical bills covered. The small house in Millhaven where Delia had grown up kept out of foreclosure. 1 year, then she could go wherever she wanted. She signed. The ranch was nothing like she'd imagined, which was embarrassing to admit because she'd spent 2 weeks imagining it in very specific terms, dark and oppressive, full of creaking doors and thin-lipped silence. Instead, it was wide. That was the word that came to her when Colt's truck turned off the county road and the property opened up around them, wide in the way that made her chest feel both small and oddly relieved. Open sky, long grass going gold in the afternoon light, a farmhouse that was large but not ostentatious, with a wraparound porch that someone had recently repainted white. Colt didn't say much on the drive. He'd picked her up from the house in Millhaven with her 2 bags and her cardboard box of kitchen things, and he'd loaded them into the truck bed without comment. And for 40 minutes they'd driven through the valley with the radio on low, and Delia looking out the passenger window like she was memorizing the landscape in case she needed to find her way back. "The housekeeper comes Tuesdays and Fridays," he said when they pulled up to the house. "Her name is June. She's been here 20 years, so she'll know where things are better than I do." "All right," Delia said. "You don't have to cook if you don't want to. There's a cook on the property for the hands, and you're welcome to eat with them, or I can have supplies brought up to the house." She looked at him then. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Not uncomfortable, exactly, but careful. Like he was aware that he'd put her in an impossible situation and was trying, in his limited way, to make the edges of it livable. "I'll cook," she said. "I like cooking." He nodded once and got out of the truck. Her room was at the end of the hall on the 2nd floor, and it had its own bathroom, and there was a window that looked out over the east pasture where 3 horses stood in the early evening shadow. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands flat on the quilt, old fabric, faded blue and cream, and told herself she had done the right thing. Her mother was being moved to a better facility. The house was safe. 1 year. She just had to get through 1 year. The first week, she learned the house. It wasn't difficult to manage. Colt was orderly in the way of someone who had lived alone for a long time and developed systems out of necessity. The pantry was organized. The bills were filed. He left early and came in after dark, and didn't ask her to account for her time, which she appreciated more than she'd expected to. What she hadn't expected was the loneliness of it, not his fault. He was simply gone most of the day, out with the hands, dealing with whatever 11,000 acres required of a person. And Delia was left in a house that was large enough to feel empty. She cleaned things that didn't need cleaning. She reorganized the pantry the way she'd have done it, not because his way was wrong, but because she needed something to do with her hands. She drove into Millhaven twice to visit her mother, who was sleeping more than she was awake these days, and who squeezed Delia's hand when she came in and called her sweetheart, and that small word undid Delia completely on the drive back both times. She didn't let herself cry until she was through the gate and up the long drive and parked in front of the house. Then she sat in the truck for a few minutes and let it happen, and then she went inside and started dinner. The third time she did this, she came inside to find Colt already in the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water from the tap. He looked at her face and then looked away. "Rough day," he said. "My mother wasn't awake when I visited. I'm sorry." He said it simply, without elaboration, and went back to his water. Delia started pulling things from the refrigerator, and they moved around each other in the kitchen without difficulty, as though they'd already worked out a choreography she didn't remember learning. When the food was done and she set it on the table, he sat down across from her and passed the salt before she asked for it. She didn't know what to make of him. The town was the harder thing. Millhaven was small enough that everyone knew Colt Rayner's business, which meant they knew Delia's business too. The woman at the pharmacy asked how she was settling in with a smile that had too much in it. The man at the feed store clapped Colt on the shoulder when they came in together for supplies, and said something low that Delia wasn't meant to hear but did. His father's debt, finally collected, and the way he said it made her feel like an item on a ledger. She didn't tell Colt. She didn't think he'd meant it that way, and she wasn't interested in making him feel guilty for something the town had decided on its own. But she felt it following her, the way a small place always assigns a story to people and then refuses to let them be anything else. What she hadn't anticipated was June. June Tillman was 62 years old, had been cleaning and managing the Rayner house since before Colt's father passed, and had opinions about everything, which she dispensed freely and without apology. She arrived the first Tuesday morning and looked at Delia's reorganized pantry and said, in a way that meant several things at once, and then she looked at Delia and said, "You're younger than I expected." "I'm 27, Delia said. "I know how old you are." June pulled out her cleaning supplies from a cabinet under the sink that Delia hadn't found yet. "I just expected you to look more like someone who'd made a calculation." "I did make a calculation. I know that too." June didn't say anything else for a while. Then, wringing out a cloth over the sink, she added, "He's not what people say he is, you know. People in this town have made up their minds about the Rayners for 40 years, most of what they think is wrong." Delia didn't answer. She wasn't ready to have that conversation yet. The thing about Colt was that he showed you who he was in pieces. There was the morning she came downstairs early, before 6, and found him at the kitchen table with the ranch's accounts spread out in front of him and a cup of coffee gone cold at his elbow. He didn't hear her come in. She watched him for a moment. The way he moved his finger down a column of numbers, the small furrow between his brows, and felt, for the first time, that she was seeing something true about him. Not the arrangement, not the debt, not the man who had sat across from her in the county clerk's office. Just a person dealing with the ordinary difficulties of keeping something alive. She made a fresh pot of coffee and set a mug next to his elbow without commenting on the cold one, and he looked up and said, "Thank you," and went back to his numbers. There was the afternoon she found him in the barn with one of the older horses, a gray named Pocket, who'd gone lame in the rear left, and Colt was crouched down next to the horse's leg with his hand resting there, not examining it, just resting. The horse had his head turned slightly toward him. Neither of them was doing anything. Delia stood at the barn door for a moment and then left quietly, not wanting to interrupt whatever that was. There was the evening a hand came to the house with a problem. Something about a calf stuck in the fence on the north property, and the hand was 18 years old and visibly panicked. And Colt didn't raise his voice or show any impatience. He just got his boots back on and went with the kid, and Delia watched from the porch as the truck's taillights went down the drive and thought, "He's done this 10,000 times, and he still goes." She mentioned it at dinner that night, and he said, "That's the job." And she said, "Not everyone treats it like the job." And he looked at her across the table like he wasn't sure what to do with that. She wasn't sure what to do with herself, either. There was a man named Doyle Speck who came to the property in the 6th week. She didn't know who he was at first. She saw him from the kitchen window, a truck she didn't recognize parked in the drive, and when she came out onto the porch, Colt was already there, standing at the top of the steps with his arms at his sides, in a way she'd come to recognize as the way he stood when something required him to be very still. Doyle Speck was in his 50s, with a county commissioner's ID on a lanyard around his neck, and he was there, he explained pleasantly, to discuss a boundary survey on the eastern pasture. There was, he said, some question about whether the fence line currently in use matched the legal boundary. Colt said the fence line had been where it was for 60 years. Speck said that was likely true, but the question had been raised, and there were some parties interested in the matter, and he was just there to make sure everyone understood the timeline for resolution. After Speck left, Colt stood on the porch for a long moment and didn't say anything. Delia had been there the whole time, off to his left, and she wasn't sure if he'd noticed. Then he said, without looking at her, "Development company out of Billings. They've been trying to get that parcel for 2 years. The boundary survey is real? The survey's real. The question about whether it matters is something else." He finally turned and looked at her. Something in his face had gone quiet in a way she hadn't seen before. "It's 300 acres. It's the best winter grazing on the property." She looked at him for a moment. "What are you going to do?" "What I always do," he said. "Handle it." She almost said something then. She almost told him that she'd noticed, that she'd been paying attention for 6 weeks, and she knew the difference between how he talked about the land and how he talked about everything else, which was that when he talked about the land, he stopped being careful. He just said what was true. But she didn't say it yet. The days got shorter, and the work on the property changed with the season. Delia started going out more, partly out of restlessness, and partly because June had let slip that some of the Hans families lived in small houses on the far edge of the east pasture, and one of the women there, a redhead named Patsy, with twin 8-year-olds, had knocked on the main house door the second week, asking if the new Mrs. Rayner might want to come to the community supper. They held the first Saturday of the month in the equipment barn. Delia went. It was not what she expected. The barn smelled like hay and motor oil and someone's slow-cooked brisket, and there were maybe 40 people crammed around folding tables, and 3 of the older children had an argument about a card game in the corner that nobody intervened in because nobody seemed worried they couldn't resolve it themselves. Patsy introduced her around with a warmth that felt genuine, and nobody asked her about the debt or the arrangement. They asked if she'd grown up in the valley. No, Millhaven, the town side. And whether she'd ever seen the North Ridge in the snow, not yet. And whether Colt had shown her the creek that came off the mountain in spring. He hadn't. She came home, and Colt was still up, reading at the kitchen table with his boots off, and she stood in the doorway and said, "You have a whole community of people living on this land." He put his book down. 23 families, last count. I didn't know that. I should have told you. He paused. Was it all right? The supper? It was nice, she said. And then because it was true and she'd decided to say true things when she had them. I liked it very much. He picked his book back up, but she noticed he wasn't reading it. The Speck situation grew. Over the next 3 weeks, there were letters from the development company's attorneys, a second visit from Speck, and a meeting with the county surveyor that Colt came home from with a jaw so tight he barely spoke at dinner. Delia read what she could find online about the company. Hendrick Holdings out of Billings, 3 active projects in the valley, 2 of which had gone through contested boundary procedures in the last 4 years. She put together a folder of what she found and left it on the kitchen table without comment. He found it the next morning and went through it over coffee. She was making eggs and didn't look at him. "Where did you get this?" he said. "Public records, mostly. Some local news coverage." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to do this." "I know." She turned around and looked at him across the kitchen. He was holding the folder and looking at her with an expression she didn't have a word for. Not gratitude exactly, which she suspected he didn't know how to do in the conventional way. Something more like recognition. Like she'd done something he'd been trying to do himself and hadn't thought to ask for help with. The second project on that list, she said, the one in Jefferson County in 2021. They lost the boundary claim, but they tied up the operation in legal fees for 14 months. That's their method. He set the folder down. "You think they're trying to run out the clock. I think someone's paying them to try." He was quiet again for a moment. "Who taught you to research like that?" "My mother was a paralegal for 20 years, Delia said, before she got sick." Something shifted in his face when she said it. Not pity, she'd have felt that immediately and reacted to it. Something quieter, a settling, like a piece of information that had rearranged something he'd been carrying. "I'm sorry about your mother," he said. "Not the way I said it before. I mean, I'm actually sorry." "I know," she said, and she did. There was a night in November when the temperature dropped 20 degrees in 4 hours, and the pipes in the old horse barn threatened to freeze. And there was a general emergency on the property that lasted from 9 in the evening until 2 in the morning. Delia spent most of it in the main barn with Patsy and 2 of the hands, moving horses and running warm water through hoses and doing whatever June, who appeared out of nowhere in an enormous down coat, told them to do. Colt was everywhere. That was the only way she could describe it afterward. He went from the horse barn to the main house, to the east fence line, where a water trough had actually frozen, and he never raised his voice, and he never lost track of what needed to happen next. At one point she passed him in the barn aisle, and he said, without looking up from the pipe fitting he was working on, "You should go inside." "I'm fine," she said. "I know you're fine. I'm saying you should go inside. What would actually help you right now?" she said. He looked up then. "There's a woman in the equipment barn who's been keeping 2 kids warm with a space heater, and she's probably running out of coffee." "I can fix that," Delia said. She went and fixed it. At 2 in the morning, when everything was stable, she found him in the kitchen, filthy and tired, and she made him sit down and put a plate in front of him, without asking whether he wanted it. He ate without looking up, and when he was done he said, "Thank you," and she said, "Don't mention it," and they both sat there for a while in the warm kitchen, with the wind still going outside. "This happens a few times a year," he said. "I figured you handled it." She looked at him. "It's my home right now," she said. "For the year." He didn't say anything. But she watched something move across his face that she hadn't seen before and couldn't name. The hearing about the boundary dispute was set for the 3rd week of December at the county courthouse in Millhaven. Delia found out about it from June, not from Colt, which irritated her in a way she couldn't entirely justify. She brought it up at dinner. "I wasn't keeping it from you," he said. "I didn't think you'd want to be involved. Why wouldn't I want to be involved?" He considered this with the seriousness with which he considered most things. "Because it's my problem." "The research I did," she said. "Who was that for?" A pause. "That was. I appreciate that." "Colt." She set down her fork. "I've been here 4 months. I know how many cattle are on the north pasture. I know that Junior Flores has a bad knee that flares up in cold weather, and you move him to lighter work in November without making him ask. I know that the east fence line needs work before spring, and you're putting it off because you're managing everything else. I know." She stopped herself. "I know this place. I didn't plan to, but I do." He was looking at her very carefully. "I want to be at the hearing," she said. "All right," he said. "And I want to talk to your attorney before it." "All right." She picked her fork back up. He was still looking at her, and this time she recognized what was in his expression. It was the same thing she'd felt standing in that barn aisle in November. The particular, wordless quality of being seen clearly by someone you hadn't expected to see you at all. The county hearing lasted 3 hours. Delia sat beside Colt's attorney and didn't speak for most of it, which was what they'd agreed on. She was there to listen. But in the final 20 minutes, when the Hendrick Holdings representative introduced a survey document dated 2019 that contradicted the original plat, she passed a note to the attorney with a case number from the Jefferson County proceedings that showed Hendrick Holdings had used an identical document in that dispute, a document that the Jefferson County assessor had declined to recognize. The attorney used it. The hearing was continued, not resolved, but the commissioner, not Speck, who had recused himself, apparently that had been its own small fight, said the 2019 document would require independent verification before it could be entered into evidence. Hendrick Holdings' representative left looking like a person who hadn't expected to be inconvenienced. Outside on the courthouse steps, in the December cold, Colt said, "How did you have that case number in your head?" "I didn't," Delia said. "It was in the folder. You brought the folder to the hearing." "I brought the folder to the hearing." He looked at her for a moment, and then he did something she hadn't seen him do before. He laughed. Not a big laugh, not the kind that takes over a person. A short, genuine sound, like something that had been held in a long time, had finally found a small exit. And she found herself smiling without meaning to, there on the frozen courthouse steps with the wind coming off the mountains, and she thought, "I don't know what this is, but it is something." She called her mother that night from the kitchen, and her mother was awake, which was rarer now. Her mother asked how she was doing, really doing, and Delia looked around the kitchen, The pantry she'd organized, the chair Colt always sat in, the window over the sink that faced east toward the pasture, and said, "I think I'm okay, Mama. I think things are okay." Her mother said, "You sound different. Different how? Less like you're bracing for something." Delia didn't say anything to that for a moment. "I'll come see you Thursday," she said. "I know you will, sweetheart. You always come." January was cold and clear and relentless, and the property required everything. Delia found that she had stopped counting the weeks remaining. Not because she'd forgotten the arrangement. The papers were still real. The year was still real. But because somewhere around the community supper in October, or the frozen pipes in November, or the courthouse steps in December, the arithmetic had changed. She was not managing the year. She was living in it. Colt had noticed, she thought. He'd started talking to her differently. Not longer. He was still not a person who used words casually, but with less of the particular carefulness of someone managing a temporary situation. He told her things. The history of the creek that came off the North Ridge, which did run fast in spring, just like Patsy had said. The reason the east fence needed replacing, his father had used the wrong grade of wire in 1987, and it had been a problem ever since. The name of the Gray Horse Pocket, which had been given by his sister 20 years ago, before she moved to Portland, and which Colt had never changed. She told him things, too. About her mother's house in Millhaven, which smelled like the same dish soap it had smelled like her entire life. About the job she'd left in Bozeman, office management for a small engineering firm, and the manager there who'd been generous about the leave of absence. More generous than she deserved. About her father, which was harder. The debt he'd left her was not the only thing. Colt listened the way he did everything else, fully, without performing it. One evening in late January, she said something that surprised her as she was saying it. They were at the table after dinner, and she'd been telling him about her mother's court days, the cases she'd worked on, the way her mother could hold the structure of a complicated argument in her head without writing it down. And she said, "I used to want to be a lawyer. When I was in high school, I gave it up because we couldn't afford." She stopped. "I gave it up," Colt said. "The year ends in June." She looked at him. "Law school applications," he said. "Some programs have late deadlines. I don't know enough about it to say more than that." She sat with that for a moment. He wasn't offering anything. He was just noting what was possible, in the way he noted things that needed fixing or attention, without sentiment and without expectation. And somehow that made it land harder than if he'd made it a gesture. "Why are you telling me that?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I don't think you should stop at 1 year," he said. "I don't mean." He paused, choosing carefully. "I mean you shouldn't stop at 1 year of knowing what you're capable of." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with a sound that was almost familiar to her now. "I became something I didn't know I was," she said. And she meant it for herself, but she was looking at him when she said it. The boundary dispute resolved in February, when Hendrick Holdings withdrew the 2019 survey after independent verification confirmed what Delia's research had suggested. The eastern pasture stayed where it had always been. Colt told her on a Tuesday morning over coffee, matter-of-factly, the way he told her things that mattered. That weekend, without discussing it, they drove into Millhaven together and had lunch at the diner on First Street, and afterward walked down the block to visit her mother's empty house. Her mother was in a care facility now, better than the first one, and the house was rented to a young couple who kept it neatly. And Delia stood on the sidewalk in front of it for a while and felt something release in her chest that had been held there a very long time. "She's going to be all right," Colt said. He didn't know that, but he said it in the tone of someone who had decided to mean it. "She might be," Delia said. "She's tough. I know where she gets it." She looked at him. He was looking at the house, not at her, and he had the slightly braced quality of a man who had said something true in public and was now waiting to see what happened next. She didn't let him wait long. "Colt," she said. When June comes, yes, I don't want to go." He turned then. He looked at her the way he looked at things that required his full attention, which meant he looked at her completely, and without pretending he wasn't. "Then don't," he said. It wasn't poetry. He wasn't built for poetry. But it was Colt, which she'd come to understand was its own language, direct without excess, meaning precisely what it said, and nothing less. and standing on the sidewalk in front of her mother's rented house with the February light going thin and flat over the valley, Delia felt the year she'd been counting down turn into something else. Not an ending, a ground. They drove back through the valley in the late afternoon, the same road she'd watched out the passenger window 4 months ago, trying to memorize the way back. She wasn't memorizing anything now. She was just watching it go past, the long grass and the open sky, and feeling, without quite having a word for it yet, that she already knew the way home.